I'd like for you to keep at least 50% of your attention on your body and breath as I'm talking. That'll be your mindfulness practice to see how that works. And the other thing I want you to just consider is this question maybe rolling around in the back of your head while I'm speaking, which is, why are matters of race still matters of concern? And what does this have to do with me? Why are matters of race still matters of concern? And what does this have to do with me? Because that is the question, the what does it have to do with me part. Because a lot of times we can look out and see the issues out there and see the chronic fatigue that they represent. But this question around what it has to do with me is what I'm most intrigued with. And so this work I'm talking to you about is looking at how do I transform racism from the inside out. And what does mindfulness have to do with that? So racism remains one of the most rooted and painful impasses of our time. And it's fed through unawareness, the misuse of power, and our inability to be with the truth that it is. It's hard to bear the truth of it. So we all have our little ways that we don't go there. The current injury and injustice that we see in the world that's so pervasive right now, this kind of in our social fabric, is the result of past seeds that were planted, consciousness that was planted. So what we're seeing are the blooms of that consciousness. And the challenge we have as inheritors of our ancestors and the racial unfinished business is what are we going to do with that? What seeds are we going to plant that will bloom, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we're conscious or not? Unawareness has impact. And so this is really about how we wake up to our part in our relationship to race and racism. It's a personal inquiry that requires a certain decolonization of mind, is a term that I'm hearing a lot by Michael Yellowbird. I refer to racism as a heart disease, and it's curable. It's one of those heart diseases that are curable. American novelist and social critic James Baldwin left the United States and moved to France due to the racism he experienced here in the States, like so many black folks at that time. And in 1957, when the image of Dorothy Counts, who was 15 years old, was plastered all over the television as the first black student admitted to Harry Harding High School in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live. She was walking to school alone, and there was a hate mob surrounding her of white people and their parents surrounding her as she went to school. And James Baldwin said, we should have been there for her. And what he did was he left France and moved back to the States and became actively involved in the civil rights movement. He said, I can simply no longer sit around Paris discussing the Algerian and the Black American problem. Everybody must pay their dues. And it was my time to go home and pay mine. So this work, this book is one of the many ways over the years that I consider paying my dues, continuing to talk about what most people would like to think we're done with. I would like to think we're done with. It would be great if we were, but we're not. So he leaves us with this question, how do you pay your dues? What is that for you? What is that for you? I find that people need to be uncomfortable before they do something different. This discomfort is what I call a competency for awakening around race. James Baldwin refers to it. He says, people who do not suffer cannot grow up and can never discover who they are. So there's a relationship to suffering and to waking up that's there. In our tradition, there's a term called samvega, a Pali term called samvega. And Bhikkhu Bodhi describes it as an inner commotion or shock, which does not allow us to rest content with our habitual adjustment to the world. Instead, it drives us on out of our cozy palaces and into unfamiliar jungles to do our work with diligence and authentic solutions to our existential plaint. We need to be a little stimulated. So my hope tonight is to stimulate you a little bit. James Baldwin, he's such a teacher for us at this time and all times. He says that a country is only as strong as the people who make it up. And the country turns into what people want it to become. We made this world we're living in, and we have to make it over. So what does that look like in your life? Sometimes it looks like we have a lot of information, but it's not integrated. It doesn't become a practice. And that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book, because it gives us a practice of how to be with this, just like our mindfulness practice gives us the 8 of this, the 5 of that, the 6 of that. We need a structure to decolonize the mind. My professional training in clinical psychology and organizational development gave me a lot in terms of understanding how systems work and power dynamics and group process. But it didn't deal with the righteous rage that I had about race. It didn't help me deal with the stewing and the disturbance that I felt in my heart around it. And the times when I would go totally numb because I just couldn't bear another wave of assault. It was mindfulness meditation that supported that kind of intersection. So to have the information around race is one thing, but to really drop it into practice, I think is really revelatory. And it profoundly is a deal changer. So mindfulness helps us put a critical pause between our habits of mind, our impulses. And it allows us to kind of hang in that space a little longer so that we can choose and not be knocked off the center of our seats. See, too many of us want to wake up. We want racial distress to go away without first caring for it. We want it to go away, but we don't want to be touched by it. We don't want to be disturbed by it. We don't want to be ruffled by it. But we can't care for the heart disease if we can't really meet it and hear the diagnosis and be with the harsh reality that it is quite the plague right now. And so many of us come into this practice, hoping to give our heart to the ultimate reality, and we bypass the relative reality, which is our relational field, which is our field of kinship, which is our field of division and our fear field. But sometimes we come in and we sit on the cushion and we just want all that to kind of go away without being touched by race and racism. So I've carved out race out of the gestalt of social ills because it's the most entrenched, it's the most unfinished. It's like a repetitive motion injury. It's chronic fatigue. It's generational. It's still alive and well, and even more emboldened at this time, politically. So one of the things that I'm dealing with in the book is 3 sections of activity. One is I'm looking at the structure of racism, our conditioning around race and racism, and the shape of it. I'm looking at the shape of dominance and subordination as it relates to race and our racial conditioning. Because we really need to understand the mechanism of how we've all been conditioned around it. This is our part in it, what it has to do with us. And so we want to understand some of those dynamics, the patterns, the tattoos, the deep grooves, the habits of mind that interfere with our sense of wholesomeness as a large body of humans. And then in the second part of the book, I'm looking at mindfulness tools, mindfulness practices that support us to stay present with our numbness, or with our rage, or with our kind of impulse to maybe toss it outside of ourselves. And we're looking at the power of forgiveness and how to stay close to the stimulation that gets activated around rage, around race, so that we can figure out how to attend to it. The Vedana, or the feeling tone that comes up when we're doing our practice. And then in the third part of the book, I'm looking at a culture of care. The so what of it, the part that supports us in really holding each other. It's kind of like, what is race beyond racism? And is there a way that we can be with ourselves absent of some of the habitual ways that we get stuck and caught? So I want to say a little bit about this first part of the book, which is really looking at the dynamics, our habits of mind, and the conditioning around race. And one of the ways I talk about it is that we're all good individuals, and we're all part of racial group identities. Some of us can relate to that, and some of us can't, or we don't kind of plug into that. In the book, I use gross language like black folks, people of color, white folks, not to separate us, but to acknowledge that the separation exists, so that we can begin to have the conversation without having language be a barrier so much. You know what I'm talking about. It's a way of pointing to a pattern of pain, and that's the whole point of using the labels. So if we look at individual and racial group identity, many people of color groups can relate to racial identity. Many white people don't relate to being part of a white race. Many white people relate to being individuals. So on these two parts of what I refer to as a Rubik, white people tend to show up in the racial conversation as good, well-meaning individuals. People of color show up as a group representing a group identity that has history and ways of having to navigate dominant white culture. And we miss each other. Because when white folks start talking about the good individual thing without acknowledging that they're a part of a membership and whiteness, we miss each other. So this is one of the ways that we really trip each other up when we try to come to the table to talk. Because we're all good individuals. But when it comes to race, we're all part of racial group identities, and that means something. Part of what's challenging about the individual, the good white individual, is that characteristic of any dominant group, whether it's white or male or heterosexual or Christian, all of these kind of profiles, characteristic of any dominant group is that you don't see yourself as collective. That's part of what it means in the dominant group. You don't feel membered. You feel like there's oftentimes individual efforts. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. If I could do it, anybody could do it. This is some of the mindset that goes with dominance. This is not criticism. These are observable things. These are observable behaviors that we can bring awareness to and then see your part in it. So characteristic of dominance in our social realm is that dominant folks, white folks in this sense, collectively, as a collective, define social norms, control resources. There's a presumed social notion of superiority. Many people in dominant groups do not notice or understand subordinated racial group members' experience. And the focus is individual, unaware of being a racial group with impinging impact on other races. The awareness is not there because the groupness or whiteness hasn't been vetted. It hasn't been investigated. So it's that investigation that then cultivates a sense of membership and understanding of who we are collectively. And by and large, that work hasn't been done. It's starting to be done, but it hasn't been done in a lot of places. The common mindset of dominant racial groups is, convince me again why I need to slow down and then hear this so that I might change. There's a mindset like that. So people are running after, trying to get all of these individuals to listen up. Subordinated racial groups, people of color, have a different mindset. So there's we react or assimilate to social norms or fight them like hell. There's a social presumption of inferiority. We notice and understand dominant racial group experiences because our life depends on it, right? And there's a group identity focus. There's awareness of racial groups. They're aware of being a racial group that is infringed upon. And the common mindset is, you won't get away with hurting us, and damn it, you got away with hurting us. So the only way to understand dominant and subordinated racial group dynamics is to keep the mindset at the group level, because it doesn't work if you're looking at the individual level. So within the racial group identities, which we are all members of, there are some dynamics that we can begin to notice that are detailed in the book. And there's what I refer to as 6 hindrances. And I can't go over all of them right now, but I do want to go over a couple. One is the hindrance of what I refer to as the stars and the constellation. It kind of goes with individual and group identity dynamics. And I'll just refer back to Michael Brown, the African-American 18-year-old who was killed by the white police officer, 28-year-old white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. And there's a group of us that got together in Charlotte to see the clip of that and talk about it. It was a difficult conversation. And there was a white guy in the group I was in who said, you know, I can't believe that guy killed that guy like that and left him, and this was horrible. It should have never happened. He was trembling, he was shaking, he was visibly upset. And when I shared, I said, I can't believe again that a white police officer has killed an unarmed black man. And I too was shaking and visibly upset. We both saw the same clip. He saw the stars, I saw the constellation. He saw an individual act, I saw the Big Dipper. I saw a recurring pattern. And when you see a recurring pattern, it's hard not to see a recurring pattern. When you don't see a recurring pattern, all you see are the stars, the individual incidents. So another way to look at that is you hear people saying, well, all lives matter, stars. Black lives matter, constellation, right? So it's not so much about what the president or Trump is doing at this time. It's also about the system that holds, the constellation that holds it in place. It's not so much about Ralph Northam as much as it is also about the institution that allowed the image to be in the yearbook, the constellation. Martin Luther King says we must be concerned not merely about who murdered the children. He was referring to the Marty Red children in 1963, but also the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers. Constellations. How do we train the eye? How do we slow it down enough? How do we sit in our practice enough? How do we get our heart and mind fortified enough to bear witness to the constellation, to be touched by what's happening in the world? You know, to focus on the individual is an incomplete perception. And such perceptions feed dominance, and it interferes with there being collective responsibility for what's happening, if we're just looking at the stars. So we need to notice constellations. So when we notice constellations, we can also see the same patterns of harm towards Aboriginal people, immigrants, dark bodies. We can see the dynamic replicating itself in Palestine, Syria, Tibet, Australia, Denmark, Bosnia, the United States. That same cha-cha, that same tattoo. And then we can also, if we're looking at constellations, we can see the systemic patterns that depend on oppressive systems, such as a growing militarized police force, the prison industrial complex. It's kind of what Naomi Klein refers to as disaster capitalist. It's when the systems organize around and predict disasters so that there's capital gain. And these struggles interconnect, and it's important that we see all of it. In our mindfulness practice, we're trained that mindfulness is not just the object of our fixation. It's everything that comes before it, after it, and centers around it. It's all of it, not just where we get locked in. One of our beloved teachers, Utejaniya, he says, if you took the roof off of a restaurant, you would see at once the chef cooking, the people entering the restaurant, the host greeting people, and food being served. While the parts are functioning separately, we can see it all instantaneously. This is also true with ultimate and relative reality. We want to cultivate the clear seeing without separating the parts, but to honor the parts. You can focus on one function, but they are all operating at once. So what's it like when we're looking at issues of race to not be so locked in, but to zoom out and see if we can see some patterns and the spaces in between? So there's another hindrance that I talk about in the book on white privilege. And white privilege, most of the people that I talk to don't always relate to white privilege because they don't feel privileged. It's not their individual experience. But the only way to understand privilege is to look at group. But because white folks haven't looked at group, it's hard to understand collective. It hasn't been vetted. It hasn't been engaged so that there's a depth of understanding what that means to you in the gestalt of social ills around race. And there's a dynamic of collusion that happens, that maintains white privilege, and it's sameness, silence, and blindness. It's kind of this way that the privilege is able to sustain itself because of the choices the individuals are making in this unacknowledged group identity called whiteness. A statistic, I got it on Facebook, so it must be true. Back in 2015, it says, incoming Congress, 80% white men, 92% Christian, 100% unaware that this is a problem. But our dear Dr. D'Angelo, in her White Fragility book, gives us more recent statistics. The 10 richest Americans. The 10 richest Americans, 100% white, 7 of whom are among the 10 richest in the world. U.S. Congress, 90% white. U.S. government, 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. U.S. House Freedom Caucus, 99% white. Current U.S. presidential cabinet, 91% white. People who decide which TV shows we see, 93% white. People who decide which books are read, 90% white. People who decide which news is covered, 85% white. So, what happens is when whiteness is not understood at the group level, then individual whites who are in leadership positions and institutions bring their consciousness with them around race or lack thereof into leadership positions, and whiteness is perpetuated, proliferated. So it's not a matter of whether institutions are racist or not, or have racism in them or not. How could they not? Because there's not a consciousness around race. And most of these institutions weren't made with people of color in mind. That's not a criticism. I mean, the voting, a lot of everything in our political system really wasn't made for everybody to go vote. Don't be messing up the program. Racism lives in the institutions, in the policies, practices, norms, views, beliefs, presumptions. That's where racism lives. I seldom use the word racist because it looks too much at an individual. This is not an individual issue, it's a group issue, it's an institutional level issue. And it has to do with the consciousness that keeps reseeding itself It's not a criticism. It's a pattern. It's a constellation. It's something to be seen and known. And most social movements are against this kind of momentum. All of the Me Too's and the young people and the civil rights, all of this is about this strong dominance and white supremacy. White supremacy in the sense that the supremacy is dominant around all of these structures that impact our lives and the lives of so many. So, one of the key mindfulness practices that support us beginning to work with our minds is really looking at how we're perceiving. When we sit in our meditation practice, we can begin to look at the mechanism of perceiving. And one that I talk about in the book is found in the Vipassana Sutta. It has to do with we perceive, then we have thoughts and emotions about it, and then we form views, and then our views reinforce the perception, and it gets recycled. So when we slow that pattern down, we can begin to see our impulses and our habits of mind and begin to make some shifts. I remember being in Charlottesville once. I think I might have told you this story. And a woman that took me was after one of the Mindful of Race trainings, and a woman drove me to the airport. And we stopped at this intersection, and I looked up. And I said, wow, they have a street in Charlottesville called Barack Avenue. And I'm sitting in my seat, and all of a sudden I just get all pumped up, and it's all in my mind, right? And then I'm all wrapped in African gear. I'm about to call my partner and say, we need to move here. This is the progressive city. They got a Barack Avenue, and felt like my head was wrapped, and I started speaking in Swahili in my mind, and then I opened my mouth and said to the woman that was driving the car, I said, wow, I'm really impressed that you have a street here called Barack Avenue. And she cleared her throat and she says, well, in these parts we call it Barracks Avenue. I really wish I hadn't said anything, because she just messed up my whole mind. I like my thoughts, But think about how often we do that, We get a piece of information, we have a perception, then we have thoughts and emotion about it, then we have a view about the whole city or the whole situation, then we're off and running. We haven't checked any of it out, we don't know if it's true or not, but it's true in our mind, and then we're off and running. I was on an airplane, I wear these wristbands, and they say, mindful of race, not there yet. And so the steward that was showing me my seat, she says, oh, what does it say? And I said, well, mindful of race. I didn't even get a chance to say the other part. She says, oh, yes, I ran a 10K for cancer once. You're looking really good, So she took the race part, my bald head, and made an assumption that And I said, oh, thank you very much. Can you move me up the first class, please? And this same mechanism of perception, emotions, thoughts, view, perception, that's the same mechanism that pulls the trigger and kills somebody. It's the same mechanism that surrounds itself around the criminalization of dark bodies, for example. There was a woman in Brooklyn, a white woman who was in a deli and called the police in an outrage because she said this 9-year-old black boy had grabbed her behind, right? And when they played back the video, she was hysterical, and this kid was screaming, trying to understand what was wrong, and the mother was, trying to take care of him, and they played the video back, and his backpack had rubbed against her behind. And even when she saw the video, she was still outraged with how the mother responded to her. Instead of seeing that, and maybe, that was a moment. So we have our mindfulness practice, and then racial affinity groups are really useful when it comes to being in a safe place with people like your own race and really examining your conditioning. So there's a lot of instruction in the book on how to get with your own race and do some deep dive work using this practice as your foundation. So I encourage people to do that, and I'm delighted that there's so much of that being done in Charlottesville for some time. And all of this is really leading to a culture of care, a deepening and more intimate understanding of our interdependence, the role that compassion plays, and as kind of the gel that holds us together, and our sila practice of non-harming. What we're doing is really fortifying a deeper clarity and intimacy with our belonging as humans. Okay, so let me see. So it's about 8 o'clock now, and I'm wondering if there are any questions that any of you have that I might answer for you while I'm here.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I look forward to reading your book.
Mm-hmm.
I started a mindfulness practice as an African American for many reasons, but one of them was because I felt what you kind of touched on earlier, this righteous anger. And it's helped. It's definitely helped. I wonder, and maybe you touch on this in the book, I wonder if you feel that mindfulness, meditation, Buddhism would be a wonderful tool for African Americans. We are primarily, speaking of a group, we are a Christian group.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if mindfulness wouldn't be a wonderful tool for African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism.
Mm-hmm. I had a dear Dharma sister, a meditation practitioner in this tradition, who said to me, Jesus is my Lord and personal Savior, but the Buddha left instructions. And I think what she was saying, because she's a practitioner in both, is that she had the kind of specific instructions on how to work with embodying her faith through the practice of Buddhism that she hadn't been able to get elsewhere. There's something very potent about the 4 foundations of mindfulness in working with your mind, and especially with rage. Sometimes we need other things for rage. Sometimes we just need a good therapist, or we just need to go beat up on a pillow or something. But when you've done all of that and you realize that really doesn't get you very far, you can the Buddha's instructions on the 4 foundations really support this intimacy with the heat that moves through, that rage oftentimes brings with it. And so I really think it offers a beautiful practice for just working kindly with our emotions and disconnecting a bit from the stories we have that are running us ragged to really comforting the actual parts of us that are on fire internally. And one of the things I've found from the practice is that I've been able to shift from using the heat of rage for warmth and light instead of fire that burns. That's been a shift over time. But if you ask my wife, she'll tell you that just the other day, no, I'm only kidding. There's definitely been a shift, and I don't think it takes anything away from a Christian practice. I think it supports an integration and maybe raises some questions about how you're working with your mind. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ruth. You mentioned the.
Can you stand, please?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
You mentioned the dominant groups. So in this case, the white groups, we tend to come from a stance of individualism.
Yes.
But we need to be more thinking as far as group dynamics go and institutional patterns. And then you mentioned the less dominant groups, and they're coming from the location of patterns or group identity. But what about the individualism within, say, the Black community? And where I come at that is I've been at a loss as to how to make a dent in society and the ills that I see. And one way I've been trying to do it is just to act locally and individually, and, for instance, smile more at people I don't know, and particularly if I have a chance, smile at African Americans. So how, in what you're describing, how do we honor the individualism of Blacks?
How is that working for you? I'm just clear. How is it for you to smile at more Blacks? I mean, what is the issue you're running into?
Oh, there's no issue.
Mm-hmm.
There's no issue. I think I'm probably getting the most out of it. Mm-hmm. But I'm just wondering, from just coming at it from a symmetry standpoint, how do we honor the individualism of everybody, mm-hmm. including Blacks?
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah. So the way I'm coming at this is to create a certain. I'm looking again. The way to understand this pattern best is to look in terms of group dynamics. So if you're talking about one-on-one individual dynamics, I just think that's what you're doing is already beautiful. You're already trying on how am I feeling when I'm just staying present and smiling more and seeing how that feels. You're acknowledging that you benefit when that happens. You could do that tomorrow and might have a different response. As individuals go, you just never quite know. I'm wondering if part of the question isn't how do whites, going back to group level, how do whites begin to acknowledge the individual distinctions within Black community in this sense? Is that a piece of it? Yeah. How do Blacks express there? So I'm not sure of the answer of that, but what I think the work is for Black folks or for any people of color is for them to look at how their individual distinction is honored among themselves because they've been so group identified. So what happens sometimes in people of color communities is that we organize around the oppressor and our energy is focused on that, and so we don't have a chance to notice each other's distinction, right? So I don't know if I'm necessarily pointing to white people noticing that distinction. I don't think it's a bad idea, but that's kind of not the idea. I would be more inclined to invite white people to not be so focused on individual anything, but looking more at group, especially the groupness of whiteness. So I think I'm doing a bit of redirecting with your question, but I think in terms of honoring the distinction of anyone, what you've suggested of smiling more and being more present is golden. And putting some, because most, we want to stay away from thinking that it's a little loaded. If white people, for example, are wanting to honor the distinction of people of color before they've honored the distinction of groupness, then it's kind of like, what's up with that, right? It's kind of like, I've been often asked by white people, how do I be a better ally for people of color? And my response is, learn about whiteness with white people. Because that's what I think will bring a certain social equanimity to our field. So it's a big question in there, and I appreciate the attempt to work on it a little bit. Thank you.
Hi, Ruth.
Hi.
So my question has to do with suffering, and how from a Buddhist perspective, suffering is so central to our practice and the understanding of it. And I find when I'm talking to other white people about why investigating whiteness is a good thing to do, I talk about suffering, and it doesn't get through that white people have their own variant of suffering around race that's not comparable to what people of color feel, but is very much a thing. And I'm wondering, how do we talk about that in a way that non-Buddhist white people might understand? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I do get this question often. Sometimes I think our Buddhist language can interfere, if I just stay with the Buddhist track, the Buddhist language around suffering and all of the perceptions that go with what racial suffering is about doesn't always add up. So sometimes I think white people can shrink in the face of that. Oh, my life is not that hard, or I don't feel that kind of suffering. And in fact, I'm kind of doing okay, So maybe, so just in the Dharma community, we can talk about suffering, but maybe we want to talk about something more personal than that. Suffering can mean a lot of different things. So what if we talked about our own lives and how we're working, how I as a white woman is working with race and coming to know suffering from a different angle. Sharing that sometimes can be helpful. Talking to people, whether it's in this tradition or not, about your own journey of waking up to whiteness and what that's like, and how it's helping you, or where you get stuck is another way to come at it. I try not to talk to people unless I'm invited to, or there's consent. But it's a little tricky. Sometimes it's like I was saying in the last talk, that we have to say things, we have to call out a dynamic that we see. If it's somebody said something that was harmful, that caused suffering, we might have to call that out and then let go of the outcome around it. Let go of whether they like it or not, whether they agree with it or not. And what happens when we do that is we're then left with our suffering in that moment, the deep contractions we feel when we've heard somebody say something stupid or dumb or challenging. But sometimes we don't talk to people if they're not ready to hear it. Sometimes we just talk about ourselves, And sometimes we talk about intent and impact. Like if somebody says something, or if somebody's doing something, you could say something like, wow, what just happened hit me in this way. I just wanted you to know that. And then let go of the outcome. Those are some thoughts. Yeah.
I've just started in one of the groups in the book, and so I'm really new in beginning this understanding a little bit. So I read in the beginning about, and I'm curious about kind of trauma, because you mentioned that the Black community, they see their trauma kind of as a group, like they've experienced that. And sometimes as white people, we tend to see it, like we go back to our family, like we don't see it kind of as a group. And I guess I'm real curious because I feel like we have trauma a lot of times in both things. And for some reason, maybe, like you said, maybe we're blind, like we're not aware that we have this trauma as a group of whiteness that's happened to all of us. We've had this dominance, right? But I heard this today. It says none of us are free if one of us are chained. And so I'm just thinking like, I don't know exactly the question, but I guess with this dominance and the subordinate, that when it's happened as a group, then you sense the trauma collectively. And maybe when you're dominant, if you're an individual, then you're sensing the trauma individually. But the reality is, it's really sometimes both. But for some reason, the dominant, we don't see it as a group.
Yeah.
And I guess and I don't know how we raise that awareness through mindfulness, I'm sure. But I was just really interested in that point in your book. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, what I've heard from some racial affinity groups that have met over time is that through the sharing of traumas, even at the individual and family level, over time they start to see a bigger pattern, but it unfolds. It's not like you can know it's this. It unfolds over time. It comes out of hiding. And so I think that's one of the beauties of having some regularity, having a structure, being with people that are like your same race. You're gonna tumble into what your collective trauma is, and it may not be around race, but it'll be interesting to see if it is or not. One of the things I get curious about, and see, I think there's a certain thawing out that has to happen with white people to feel into some of these collective aspects of history. We can ask, sometimes with regularity, I go back and look at images of lynchings, right? So I look at that, not so much to see the black people hanging, but to see that it was a family festival. And that young people, old people, children, they dressed up to go to these, to lynchings. And I ask myself sometimes, what was happening in the mind of the little ones? How does the psyche situate itself so that becomes a thing that's okay? So there's something about that kind of thawing out that I think is in not just around lynching, I don't know what it might be, but there's historic roots that you want to touch into, and I think it's through that inquiry that you begin to see and know your collective history. And that's one of the most important reasons to be in a white racial affinity group, especially in the ways that I'm proposing it, because it deliberately points you to your conditioning, stories in your own family, So I think it's okay to be in family and look at family trauma because you ultimately bump into something a lot larger and important for you. Yeah. Let me see what we have.
Hello, Ruth. Can you handle one more question?
I can, yes.
So a couple of I took a white fragility class, and after the August 2017 thing, before that I was pretty indifferent to race and racial problems, and felt pretty protected from them. The white fragility class was really cool. And I begin to feel that I have been severed from community because I have lived my life in only part of that community, the white part. And while I have benefited from the opportunities of being a white person, I more and more deeply miss the fullness of our community as a whole, not just the white part. I want to be part of it all, and I feel this wall that we have built between the white group and everybody else. And I wonder if you have heard that or felt that or can respond to that.
Sure. No, I get this all the time, actually. The wall has been there for a long time. And I think there is a longing that we all have to belong. And, on many levels, we know something's missing when we're living in these deep grooves of division and separation. But there are reasons for it. And I think that white people can do a lot of waking up to whiteness within their communities, even if they're not diverse. It's not at the exclusion of doing other things, but that's an important piece to understand why the division exists. Because without understanding that, when you enter into the larger field, you're bringing your individual siloed consciousness with you. And what happens is when you're not awake to that and you're engaging other people of color, we end up having to use our energy to educate you. And that's why we don't see people of color just coming into white spaces, because it's just not something we want to sign up for. So when white people are doing their own work, it creates more balance to bring to the table. So the longing is actually being serviced when the whiteness work is happening. And whiteness is not an issue as long as people are waking up to its impact, So I'm not criticizing people that are all in white groups, because all of that changes when the heart changes, when the mind wakes up around race and our role in it. So, and I'll just tell another way that this is important and how it plays. I've had people that I've worked with, a woman in particular who worked in the prison system, white woman working in prison system with black folks. And I think I write about this in the book. She says, I can't wait to get to the class each week because I feel so alive when I'm around these black folks and they're telling their stories. it just brings me so much life. I can't wait to get back the next week. And I knew exactly what she meant, but there was something vampire-ish about it, right? And I asked her, I said, what are your stories? What are your stories? You know, where is the pain in what are the stories that's kept your people alive? Can you know that? Can you honor that? Can you be proud of your lineage survival? Can that be a part of your understanding of whiteness and being in this world? It's not all bad to be to be white, but can we understand our stories and our rootedness? That's what's missing. That's what helps, I think. That would serve. Yeah. Okay, where are we? We probably have time for one more.
I just wanted to make a comment more than a question. I love your book. I love you and the work you do.
We can just stop here.
But I particularly want to thank you for the hindrances because I just find that so useful. Initially, it was really painful because, you know, as I understand them, of course, I'm recalling all the times that I did all those things.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
Yeah, me too.
So it's painful, but it's also, I just find it so practical to be able to sort of apply it. And like the Buddha, you know, we can look at, okay, what's arising and am I doing one of those things?
That's right.
Just thank you for that piece.
Great. I'm glad that helps. Yeah. Okay. I appreciate your kind attention, and I would like for us to end the way we began, with you standing and facing someone near you. Taking a breath here. And taking a look here. If I didn't belong to you, I wouldn't be here. If you didn't belong to me, you wouldn't have come. My liberation is tied to your liberation. And your heart and my heart are very old friends. May we remember that we belong to each other. May we meet racial cries with as much wisdom and grace as we can muster. Namaste.